Hi everyone, I'm going to tell you how to take cuttings of your roses. It's springtime and now is an ideal time to take cuttings of roses because it's more the new growth that you want versus the old woody growth. You can take hardwood cuttings of your roses, but new growth is just so much easier. I do have a YouTube video already out on how to take just semi-hardwood cuttings in general, but I thought roses, since I'm a big fan of roses, a lot of people are a big fan of roses, that I would sort of just focus in on roses for this one. Pretty much it's the same with just a few different rules and tidbits to follow. Now, when you do your rose cuttings, you want to go and you want to find growth that is still somewhat flexible, but not so new that it's gonna wilt out. It can wilt out. So you're gonna take a few. Ideally, you're gonna have a 6 to 8 inch cutting. And remember, for cuttings, you need at least one node below the soil media and at least one node above. But with a 6 to 8 inch cutting, you're gonna have multiple nodes to put underneath your soil media and at least one node above. So no worries there as long as you do a 6 to 8 inch cutting. Now, when you do your cuttings, you should do multiples, remember, because you don't always get 100% success rate with cuttings and especially rose cuttings. So do multiples of them. You always want to put them in water right away after you do the cuttings, and you want to keep them upright because even if you lay them on its side, the hormone responsible for root formation, auxin, moves with gravity. So if you leave it on its side, some of that auxin is going to pool down at the base. You want them to be upright so it pools all around. It's not a huge deal, but you might as well put them upright, keep them in water, keep them hydrated as you're working with them. So what are you going to plant them in? Well, I always prefer to do a perlite or a perlite vermiculite mixture, 50-50. You can do sand, and you can even use a peat moss base as well. So really just what works for you. I find that the peat moss sometimes tends to rot them out a bit more, especially under a mist bench. But if you're misting them with a spray bottle or keeping them in a plastic bag, then peat moss may work. But I like to use perlite, and it's that white crunchy stuff that is in potting soil, but you could buy bags of it straight. Remember, it is sort of an expanded volcanic material, so it does seem like glass if you were to breathe it in. So always work with perlite when it is wet. So just get a pot, fill it all the way to the top, pack it in a little bit, make sure it's wet, and then you're gonna do your cuttings. So I have the cuttings sitting in water. You're gonna pull them out. Now you're gonna have to work on these cuttings. This has a lot going on for it. So remember, you want at least one node below. So I'm gonna redo my fresh cut below the node that I'm gonna have buried under. I'm gonna remove any miscellaneous branches coming off. This one had multiple growth points coming off of it. You do want leaves because remember, that's how the plant is actually growing. There's no root, so it's taking up moisture through its leaves, but you don't want so many that it can't sustain those and it's more of a hindrance than a benefit. So I'm going to remove some of the leaves, especially the lower ones. You always want to remove any foliage that is going to go below the soil media. So I'm just going to clip away. Sometimes if you have large leaves, not a problem to cut them in half, right? So that's what my cutting's looking like now. Now there are buds, and that's the sacrifice of taking spring cuttings on roses. You're gonna have to sacrifice some flowers. You don't want buds, you don't want flowers because those are energy sinks. You want all the energy to go into forming roots. So you are going to cut those off. Oh, it's so sad. It's okay. Don't worry, your roses will put on a whole bunch more buds if they're happy. So there's your cutting. Now, if you do spring cuttings, the idea is if you take the tip growth, there is enough auxin being produced at the tip that you shouldn't need a synthetic auxin. For roses, I'm gonna go ahead and dab a little bit. And so when I say a hormone, you can find it at nurseries. This is a Hormex and it's labeled as #1. That's the most mild synthetic auxin you could get. So your cutting should have enough moisture from a fresh cut. You just wanna dip it in. Remember, just a tiny, tiny bit. And now it's time to plant your cutting into the perlite. So I'm just gonna use my finger. You could use like a screwdriver or something to make a hole. And you at least want one of those nodes buried. Looks like we're just gonna get one node buried, but that's okay. From that, the roots will grow. Now, I'm not just going to do one, and I'm not just going to do one in a pot. Remember, right now they're not competing for moisture or nutrients in the soil area. It's all up here. So you could pack them in, and you're going to do multiples of them. So I'm going to do one more just to show you how different some of them are. So this one has less branching on it, but I'm going to redo a fresh cut below a node. And for roses, the nodes are pretty easy to see. There's almost a line and a bud. I'm going to cut some of these leaves in half right there. I'm going to remove this side bud, this side branch right there, and all these buds right here, right there. And there. So it's a little funky looking cutting, but it's going to work. I'm going to dip it into my rooting hormone, and I'm just going to, this one I'll just squeeze right in there. Sometimes it's best to do a pre-hole because you don't want to wipe off all the rooting hormone on there. And sometimes if they're softer cuttings, you should try to shove it in there. They can snap and break. So those are just two. Now, the perlite has already been wet, but I would go ahead and take a spray bottle and mist the foliage. Right, and now it's time to bag them up. Now, if you're doing like a 4-inch pot, you know, a Ziploc bag like this is going to work. This one's a little bit bigger, so I just happen to have this bag here that I'm going to put in. And then I'm going to loosely tie it so there's moisture in there. Probably just, you could just either tie it or do like a little twist tie. Now, if there's enough moisture, there should be condensation that forms on the side of this bag. If there isn't any, open it up and spray. The condensation is going to form after a few hours, so right away you shouldn't see it. The idea is to keep condensation on there, but not so much that it's dripping down. You could check your cuttings every once in a while. Don't check too often because you don't want to open them up and expose, you know, and let the moisture out. You always want to tug, a gentle tug, and then sometimes if you look under the pot, you'll see roots coming out. It could take a couple weeks to a month and a half for roots to form. Remember, not all of them may make it. That's why you're going to do multiples of each one. And as soon as they start getting roots, slowly open the bag, maybe cut some holes in it. If you just open it right away to the air, it might be too much of a shock. So slowly open it, then move them out, and then put them in their individual pots in potting soil, and then you can move them into wherever you want, in the ground or in pots after they go through that middle step. Where to put this bag? Don't put it outside in direct sun. Don't even put it inside in direct sun. A bright, shady area will be best. You could also use a heating mat. A little bit of warmth will help create roots a bit faster, so that's ideal. It is quite easy to do cuttings of roses with this. The idea is just to keep them moist enough. Sometimes people let them dry out, sometimes they get too wet, but that's about it. I've seen the potato method where apparently you take a potato and you stick a cutting in there and then you just bury the potato. Well, in theory, it's because the potato is going to have enough moisture that by the time it degrades, that roots have formed in it. There's no point in doing that. If I really want a rose, I'm not going to test it out by putting it in a potato. Also, I've seen the Oasis foam. Really, that may work, but you might as well just do a whole bunch in a pot of perlite. And, you know, it's fun. It might be fun. It might be a fun experiment. But I would just do the perlite vermiculite mix with a bag. And that's about it. So hopefully that's helped you. I think in my cuttings video, I do a little bit more on the hormones responsible for it, but hopefully that answers some of your questions. Thanks.